Live, where news comes first. This is ABC-7 Extra.
Look at that, just shooting back and forth. That is crazy. Look at this.
An act of terrorism is what police are calling one of the deadliest mass shootings in U.S. history. 50 people killed and dozens more hospitalized following a shootout at an Orlando nightclub that turned into a nightmare. Good evening, everyone. I'm Stephanie Guadian. For the next half hour, we will take a close look at two tough subjects tonight: the Florida massacre and the man police say pledged allegiance to ISIS. And the latest on the controversy surrounding the 6-month jail sentence for a former Stanford University swimmer convicted of sexual assault. The case has touched off an emotional national debate about leniency and campus sexual assault. You can email us your comments and your questions right now to ABC-7 Extra at KVIA.com. You can also reach us by calling in. The number is 915-496-1775, and on Twitter, just make sure to use the hashtag ABC7 Extra. We begin, though, tonight with the Florida massacre. The man behind the deadliest mass shooting in U.S. history mentioned ISIS in a 911 call during the attack. And according to investigators, Omar Mateen killed at least 50 people at an Orlando nightclub early this morning. Diane Gallagher takes us to the scene.
Attacks on any American, regardless of race, ethnicity, religion, or sexual orientation, is an attack on all of us.
June 12, 2016 marks the worst U.S. terror attack since 9/11 and the worst mass shooting in American history. Police say the 29-year-old Omar Mateen opened fire inside an Orlando LGBT nightclub. He was armed with an assault rifle and handgun. Police engaged in a shootout with a gunman outside the club, but somehow Mateen made his way back inside and took hostages.
It was just one after another, after another, after another. After everybody was out, the shootings were still going, and the cops were yelling, "Go, go, clear the area, clear the area."
Some tracked sent frantic messages to friends and family for help. After several hours, SWAT team officers broke down a door of the club with an armored vehicle and shot and killed Mateen. Now, police say that Mateen was a U.S. citizen of Afghan descent living in Fort Pierce, Florida. Since 2007, he worked as a security officer. The FBI investigated Mateen twice for potential ties to terror, but those investigations were closed. During the shooting, Mateen called 911 to pledge allegiance to ISIS. Those in Orlando and across the country say, despite the violence, terrorists will be stopped.
This will make us stronger. They will not win. Islamic terrorists need to know that they will not win.
And that was Diane Gallagher reporting for us tonight. Joining me now, Jaime Esparza, District Attorney for the 34th Judicial District, and Stephanie Karr, the Executive Director of the Center Against Sexual Assault and Family Violence. I want to thank you both for being with us tonight. A very busy day, a lot of news going on. Your first reaction when you heard about the Florida massacre, the SWAT team moved in. They did exactly what they were supposed to do.
Well, it sounds like this. You know, your first reaction is just sadness that something like this happens. But, you know, we just see more and more of this domestic terrorism. And, you know, just from reading the stories and what I could catch from the news and what I could read, seems like law enforcement responded as quickly as they could. And the community came together, as I think I would see here in El Paso as well.
Speaking of here in El Paso, you were just telling me some of our police officers have active shooter training.
Actually, I spoke to Chief Greg Allen today during the day, and you know, his officers, and I assume that the deputies as well, are trained in active shooting if that were the situation. In this case, you know, it was tempered because, well, eventually SWAT got there and then they took care of business. But we are trained, we're prepared for that situation in the eventuality it would occur. Hopefully that doesn't touch us this way, but you never know.
And for you, Stephanie, what are some of the surviving victims needing the most right now when it comes to counseling?
Well, I think that families and survivors are going to experience significant post-traumatic stress. And so what they need now is support and comfort and a significant amount of time just to process what has happened to them and think about how they'll go about healing.
The shooter in this case, police say the shooter was killed by the SWAT team. What do you think that means for the families of the people who died? Is there a frustration there, knowing that this person isn't going to be held accountable and punished for what happened?
Well, I think, Stephanie, every family is going to have a different reaction to that. I think for some families, if they lost a loved one, that they're going to feel that that's appropriate that he lost his life as well. Other families may feel differently, that they really want to see justice served through the judicial system.
You know, when we talk to victims, I think Stephanie's right, the reaction will vary. But one of the things that we won't have to see is just the prolonged nature of a trial. And that really can be very difficult on victims of crime. The judicial process is not easy. And then they have to relive the incident many times over before the actual trial occurs, and even afterwards. Plus, we won't know the full story because he was killed. So that's another thing that we'll be missing. But, you know, there's nothing good to say about this. It's sad. I mean, 50 people have lost their lives. There's no way a community can prepare for something like this. You got to stay vigilant, and you know, we got to take care of each other. So I think it's really difficult to try to predict how victims would feel. But you know, I think as usual, victims, I think what they like most is they want information, and they do want to see justice done.
You and I were just talking about how difficult and frightening it must have been for people inside of that nightclub. There was loud music, there were a lot of people there, it was dark, and you said maybe you've actually had to put some thought into a situation like that. What would you do?
Right, I think there's no way to be prepared. I mean, why would you on a Saturday night, you go to a nightclub and you know, you're enjoying yourself. Who would ever have thought that this would have occurred? And I think you probably have to be prepared in advance if you're going to do something to try to prevent the greater loss of life here. You know, it's a tragic story, and hopefully, you know, we'll make some sense of it and be able to protect ourselves further.
The FBI investigated Oman Mateen twice before for potential ties to terror, and he was on a watch list, yet he was able just recently to go out and buy guns.
Well, I think there's really more than one issue there, but my reading of the stories is that in each time the FBI looked into the situation, it was unfounded. And so if it's unfounded, I don't think you can prevent him from purchasing a weapon. But still, we still have the question, just like we have in other shootings. You know, we have an assault rifle in a situation where do we really need to be able to purchase those? And that discussion, we've had that discussion every time we've had these shootings. Every time we've had these mass shootings, we've not resolved it. Maybe this discussion will be able to move this issue in a smart and thoughtful way, but we still haven't resolved it.
And we've had other terrorist acts done by Americans before. This one, though, a little bit different because on top of the terrorism, we also have what is most likely a hate crime.
Well, what we see is that there are groups in our society that people still focus and target with hatred and discrimination. And so whether that's an LGBTQ community or women on campus that we'll talk about later, there are individuals and groups that target and deliberately plan harm for others.
Okay. Anything different stands out about this terrorism act for you?
You know, to me, it just highlights, one, how vulnerable we are as a society. We like our freedom, we are vulnerable, and how we have to stay vigilant and continually protect ourselves. And one thing that's good about El Paso, I mean, we are one of the safest cities in the country. I think it's because the way we come together and the way we protect ourselves. Because our safe city doesn't come just from law enforcement. It comes from the whole community. And I think we will continue to stay vigilant. Like, there is no way. I mean, when you went to bed on Saturday night, could you have ever thought that something as horrible as this would have occurred on Sunday? You would have never thought of that.
No, I don't think so. And certainly this is just a story that we are beginning to cover. A lot more going to come out during this week, and we here at ABC are going to continue to cover that story. Our other big topic tonight, emotions running high after a 6-month sentence is handed down to a former college student convicted of sexually assaulting an unconscious woman. Brock Turner was a student athlete at Stanford University at the time of that assault. There have been letters of support sent to the judge from his family and friends, and that is drawing outrage from critics who say they are trying to shift blame from a 20-year-old man who won't take responsibility for his actions. We posted this story on our KVIA Facebook page. Kim Axtell writes, "You know, he and his father's lies to save him from prison time may have worked, but I hope the shameful act follows their every footstep until they both repent." Mary Arona writes, "He needed to go to prison for many, many years. He should have taken his father and the judge with him." You're watching ABC-7 Extra. When we come back, our guests weigh in on the Stanford sexual assault case. Boxes full of petitions are delivered to a government office calling for the judge to be removed after he gave Brock Turner a 6-month sentence. And remember, if you'd like to share your comments or if you have questions for our guests, you can call our comment line 915-496-1775. And if you're online right now, you can email us to ABC7Extra@KVIA.com. You can also tweet me at Guadian, ABC7. Use the hashtag ABC7Extra. You're watching ABC7 Extra, where news comes first. To ABC7 Extra, outrage is growing over the conviction in the Stanford University sexual assault case. A former university swimmer was sentenced to 6 months for sexually assaulting an unconscious woman last year. What's causing the uproar to grow are some letters sent to the court, including one letter from the victim herself. Sarah Sidner reports.
"You don't know me, but you've been inside me. And that's why we're here today."
I was butt naked all the way down to my boots, legs spread apart, and had been penetrated by a foreign object by someone I did not recognize.
I stood there examining my body beneath the stream of water, and I decided I don't want my body anymore.
The searing words of a sexual assault victim brought to life by people who have never met her but want her voice heard. The 12-page letter first read aloud in court by the 23-year-old sexual assault victim to her 20-year-old attacker, former Stanford student and swimmer Brock Turner. The two go to the same party, both drink too much, and Brock Turner attacks her. Two graduate students find her unconscious behind a dumpster. A jury convicts Turner of 3 felony counts. The prosecutor asks for 6 years in jail. The judge sentences him to just 6 months in jail and 3 years probation, in line with the probation officer's recommendation. His ruling sparks outrage.
It says, if you are raped on a college campus in California, you are on your own. And to potential perpetrators, it says, don't worry, we have your back.
Now more than 1 million people have signed online petitions calling for the judge to be recalled. Those petitions now delivered to the California Judicial Performance Commission. And the fury is still growing as letters to the court from Brock Turner, his father, and supporters become public. In Brock's letter to the court, he apologizes, saying in part, "It debilitates me to think that my actions have caused her emotional and physical stress that is completely unwarranted and unfair." But he also blames campus culture for some of his actions. Coming from a small town in Ohio, I had never really experienced celebrating or partying that involved alcohol, he says. But the prosecution submitted evidence to the judge that Turner was doing a lot more than drinking, some of it before arriving at Stanford. 2014 texts on his phone show him asking for pot and talking about doing acid. And when his father tried to defend him, his words angered the public even more, saying in part, his life will never be the one that he dreamed about and worked so hard to achieve. That is a steep price to pay for 20 minutes of action out of his 20-plus years of life. But in this case, it was the deeply personal words of the victim that stirred the nation and put the spotlight on an issue so often kept in the dark.
And that was Sarah Sidner reporting for us tonight. With me tonight is Jaime Esparza, District Attorney for the 34th Judicial District, and Stephanie Karr, the Executive Director of the Center Against Sexual Assault and Family Violence. I want to thank you both for being with us. One of the points that reporter just made at the end was this is shedding some light on a subject that is perhaps not often talked about. It's certainly gaining a lot of the nation's attention. Is this one positive thing to come out of this? People are talking?
Well, we certainly are glad to have people talking. However, this is a terribly tragic and horrible incident, but it is one of so many. And there are multiple factors. Victims are often very reluctant to come forward because, as we can see, the turmoil in the investigation the scrutiny on victims and the tendency to blame them for something that has happened to them by someone else makes them reluctant to come forward. And so if we look at what happened to this particular victim, I believe the message to others is, look what's going to happen. You're going to go through a year of turmoil and trauma, and at the end of the day, this is the justice that's served. So the message, as the reporter mentioned earlier, is discouraging at the very best.
From a legal perspective, how hard is it to get victims to go through the whole process?
Well, I think it's very difficult. It's just the offense itself. Sexual assault is such a personal and intimate crime, and the victims have an extremely difficult time just dealing with it, and then having to come and tell such a personal story of what happened to you, and it's so private. And if you read the victim impact statement that she gave, you'll see where she not only calls out what the defendant was thinking, but also how she was treated by the defense lawyer and all of the questions she was asked, which she thought were not relevant and as the defense lawyer tries to shift the blame to her, which is typical, and so it was her fault. Everything she did was her fault, and the alcohol was her fault, and how she dressed, and all those issues. And so it's very difficult to bring these cases before a trial. You can just imagine trying to talk to the victim and tell them, well, we're going to put your case on and we're going to tell your story, but you're on cross-examination and there's going to be a lot of questions asked you about your personal life, about your private life, who you've dated, and all sorts of issues which I think try to obscure the issue of was there a sexual assault, was there consent. Those are the issues that are important here, but in a trial, it makes it very hard for a victim. So we struggle with that. But, you know, some women are very courageous, and they know that justice can occur in the courtroom, and so we've had success.
Talk to me a little bit about, just a minute, about a trial versus with a judge and a jury.
Well, a trial before a judge is much more abbreviated. There's a lot of things that won't happen because you're not before a jury. But basically, they're still the same. The burden of proof is identical. It's still beyond a reasonable doubt. The judge in that case will do the sentencing. Although in a jury trial, the judge can also do the sentencing as well. But I think that the biggest difference is that it's probably quicker because the judge will say, okay, I don't need to hear that. Let's move on.
You were going to say?
I was going to say, Jaime eloquently spoke about what happens in the judicial system, but for many survivors of sexual assault, they get to the judicial system later, so the immediate aftermath of what's happened to them, they're in a hospital at an ER going through a sexual assault exam, being re-traumatized by that whole experience there as well. And in this victim's letter, she wrote about not disclosing what had happened to her family until it was published in the paper. And so there are many, many individuals who've never talked about what has happened to them to anyone. So what we are hoping in part is that this national discussion will encourage those who have kept this hidden for all the reasons related to shame and feel like it's their fault, that they'll come forward and seek help and understand that it's not their fault.
You mentioned a rape culture on campus. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, again, in just my brief reading about Stanford University right now, they, through the Department of Education, are under investigation through the Title IX Act for 5 sexual assault investigations, which is the highest number of any university in the country right now. And so, not only for Stanford, but if your viewers have watched The Hunting Ground recently, that also addresses sexual assault on campuses. And so when there's a high level of tolerance, when there is acceptance of violence, whether it's on a university campus or in our culture on a much larger scale, when we accept, when we minimize, when we shift blame, when we do all of those things, that creates an atmosphere of this is okay, there aren't consequences, it doesn't matter, when in fact it matters terribly.
I mean, if you look at the judge's 6 months, you have to ask yourself, well, so what was his theory in sentencing? And clearly he was focusing solely on the defendant, right? Not on actually the actions of the defendant. One thing is to be concerned about rehabilitation, but the other thing is to hold him accountable. And there are many things that the judge could have done in order to send a message, not just to his community, but elsewhere, about the crime, about deterrence, and making sure that people in that area knew that if this conduct occurs, that you will be held accountable. I think that's a really important message that's being missed here. The judge was focused on, he's a swimmer, he went to Stanford, right? I think that's important, but what is also important is what happened. This type of crime, it's so private, it's so intimate. I'm not sure he even took into account the violation and the trauma to this victim, which really, when you take into account, there's a reason the range of punishment in California was up to 14 years. The prosecutor in the case asked for 6 years. What a dramatic difference from 6 years to 6 months. So in my opinion, 6 months doesn't really hold him accountable, and it certainly sends the wrong message.
Are you surprised by the backlash that is happening against the judge right now by the public?
I'm not surprised. I think most people would think sexual assault, in California they call it rape, is such a violation that I'm not surprised. 6 months just doesn't seem right. Plus, there seems to be these added factors that students at Stanford, that somehow they took into effect the fact that he was an athlete, that he was an outstanding swimmer. I'll give him credit for all of that. That still doesn't account for his actions that night and what he had done. And if you read her, she wrote a really insightful victim impact statement. It's rather long, but when you talk about that, you know, she talks about how, you know, she just goes in detail about how much the crime has affected her and her family, and her own personal safety. And she has a sister, a younger sister, and how the sister is having such a difficult time. It just, I think that, I'm not sure what the judge was thinking, but clearly, even in your story, you see where the judge was told, knew that his excuse that, well, this was the first time. He hadn't really been in an environment where there was drinking. There was evidence to show that that's not true, right? That he wasn't being truthful to the judge. Yet we get 6 months. I don't think 6 months is really a fair sentence.
I think a lot of people would agree with you. We did have someone on our Twitter account write in and said, I believe that it is a matter of privilege. With the race case, his background kept him, the rape case I should say, his background kept him from a long prison sentence. And this has been a topic that has come up.
It certainly has come up, and we've seen that in sentencings across the nation, that those persons of color who are not wealthy, who aren't going to major universities, the sentences are significantly different, and that's a pretty well-known factor. But while we're talking about campuses, if I could interject, I would like to point to UTEP. Just recently, the university here in El Paso was awarded a grant out of the Department of Justice and the Office of Violence Against Women, the only campus in the state of Texas to receive a 3-year grant that specifically is focused on prevention of sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking, and really engaging that entire campus, faculty, staff, and students on bystander intervention, similar to what these 2 young men did in Stanford, and speaking up and standing up and eliminating this rape culture that is so pervasive. And so I really want to laud the university for being for UTEP for being proactive in this. I think it's one example of our community coming together and really trying to make sure our families and our individuals and our students are safe.
Okay. We also want to mention you have a Hope line. That is 915-593-7300. We're going to be back in just a moment. Welcome back. Colorado just passed a measure allowing victims of sexual abuse to file a case up to 20 years after the alleged crime took place. Survivors of sexual assault gathered as the governor signed the so-called Cosby bill. The measure doubles the current 10-year statute of limitations. It was prompted by the rape allegations against comedian Bill Cosby, which gained widespread attention decades after they allegedly happened. Now, the bill is supposed to encourage other survivors to come forward.
I am a victim of sexual assault, drugged and sexually assaulted by Bill Cosby here in Denver in 1986. So I'm here to tell you you can survive.
That's another high-profile case that has the public talking.
It is, and it's another example, unfortunately, of privilege and the pressure that victims put on themselves to not come forward. And so you see this whole group of women who did not speak out, and there are several reasons for that, and we've reviewed some of them, but some of that too comes from the trauma that an individual has experienced as a result of a rape and memory that's affected as a result of that. And so as time goes on and memory comes back, these come forward. I will certainly say that at the Center Against Sexual and Family Violence here in El Paso, we see many individuals who will come to us and say, this happened to me 8 years ago, this happened to me 12 years ago. I never told family or friends, and I feel like I can say something now because it's safer for me to speak.
And Jaime, this is something that you've experienced as well. You've seen women go through this.
Right, I just think it's very hard for, you know, when can you tell your story? When do you feel comfortable telling your story? You know, the criminal justice system, juries love it if you make the outcry immediate. Well, that would be nice, but it's not always that cut and dry. It's not always that pretty where you can just do that so easily. And so I think taking into account the difficulty of telling the story, being able to put that together in a coherent way. The Stanford victim, you look at how she went through that process, and she didn't tell anyone for the longest of time. And she really only learned the facts herself because of the way it went, the way it occurred went from a news story. And so it's always that just highlights the difficulty of being able to relate what has happened to them. And so I think that kind of law is really helpful.
How big of an issue is this? You have some statistics out there. How many women, is it 2 out of 3, affected at some point in their life by sexual assault?
It's 1 out of 4 women and 1 out of 6 men. And so in this conversation, we focus on women being the survivors of assault, but we certainly know that men are as well, and there's an even larger layer of resistance to a male coming forward with this kind of disclosure of sexual assault. In El Paso, we know that last year in 2015, there were 311 reported sexual assaults to the El Paso Police Department, and as of May 30, 98 this year alone. And so that's just the tip of the iceberg, because we know at our center, and I'm sure that Jaime knows as well, there's so many people do not come forward that the incidence is much higher.
Lastly, we're going to close. A teachable moment for parents. Is this something that they should sit down and talk to their kids about?
I think most parents do have that discussion with their children. I think the teachable moment for me here is that the issue is consent, and how we have dignity for ourselves and for others, and how we respect each other and have healthy relationships. This can easily get confused with, well, she's promiscuous. Oh, she was drinking. Her dress was too tight. Did you see her undergarments? That's just shifting the blame. The real issue here is consent, and we need to talk about that, and we need to have a healthy discussion about what consent means and how that occurs, and not just because you hold her hand doesn't mean yes.
Yeah, thank you both very much for joining us tonight, and we want to thank you. I'm Stephanie Guadian, and this has been ABC 7 Extra.